Viktor, Shadow Ledger, Petrov, a name whispered only in hushed tones in the darkened corners of Kiev, was a man who lived outside the boundaries of conventional reality. To most, his story was an enigma, a shadow that flickered in the streets of Ukraine's capital, always just out of sight, yet undeniably powerful. His rise in the criminal underworld was as stealthy as it was formidable, creating an empire that spanned beyond borders, hidden in the layers of secrecy and silence. But what made Viktor so elusive? Why, after all these years, does his name still echo in the underworld like a ghost, haunting those who dared to challenge him? It all started in a city that was both ancient and alive with modern tensions, Kiev. Nestled along the Dnieper River, the city had always been a center of culture and history. But beneath its vibrant surface, a different kind of history was unfolding in the shadows. The Soviet Union was crumbling, and Ukraine, freshly free yet still bound by the remnants of its past, was a land of untapped opportunities, and untold dangers. In these turbulent times, the law was flexible, and the government fractured. Amidst this chaos, Viktor Petrov made his mark, not through force or flash, but through a quiet, methodical manipulation of the world around him. He earned his nickname, Shadow Ledger, not because he was a ghost, but because he operated as one, always present, yet never seen. His was a criminal empire built on the backbone of organization and subtlety. Unlike the loud and brash figures that often dominate the mafia world, Viktor worked behind the scenes, letting others do the dirty work while he remained an untouchable force pulling the strings. It was said that he could move mountains without lifting a finger, his hands always clean, his methods untraceable. He didn't need to be seen in the back alleys or at the head of the meetings. He had something far more powerful than brute force, influence. Control. And most dangerously, the ability to make others believe they were in control, when in reality, they were nothing more than pawns in his carefully crafted game. But what was it about Viktor Petrov that made him so powerful in a world where danger and deceit were commonplace? Perhaps it was his ability to understand the rhythms of power, to know when to act and when to remain still. He was a man who watched, calculated, and waited. His empire was built not on the streets, but on the balance of trust and fear, where every ally was kept close and every enemy was kept closer. He knew how to manipulate the tides of uncertainty that swept through post-Soviet Ukraine, using the shifting allegiances and political instability to his advantage. As the years passed, his presence loomed over Kiev like a shadow, never fully acknowledged but never entirely ignored. Those who came across his path were drawn into a world they could never leave, whether they wanted to or not. There were whispers of his involvement in nearly every criminal enterprise that flourished in the shadows, from arms deals to black market oil trading, from illicit gambling rings to underground prostitution networks. Yet, no one could pinpoint his role in any of these dealings. He was the ghost in the machine, the one who made it all run, and yet, remained unseen. What made Viktor's story even more fascinating was the paradox of his life. He was a man who lived without ever truly existing in the public eye, a figure who shunned the limelight, and yet, his power was undeniable. His name was never publicly tied to any crime, at least not directly. His name was never in the papers, never on the lips of the public, but to those in the know, he was as much a part of Kiev as its monuments and history. People spoke of him in hushed tones, as though even the mention of his name could invite trouble. The man who controlled Kiev's streets had never stepped foot on them. Despite his carefully crafted image of invisibility, Viktor's influence was felt everywhere. His power wasn't derived from physical intimidation or overt displays of violence, but from an intricate web of connections and loyalties. Each player in his empire, whether they were street-level operatives or high-ranking officials, played their role without ever questioning his authority. To cross Viktor Petrov was to risk losing everything. But crossing him wasn't just dangerous, it was a near impossibility. His control was so total that those under his thumb often didn't realize they were being manipulated. And yet, this carefully constructed world of control was built on a foundation of uncertainty. Viktor was constantly surrounded by whispers, rumors of his true intentions, of who he had been before the rise, and of the price of crossing him. These were the stories that kept his legend alive, even as he remained physically distant from any confrontation. Every time someone mentioned his name, it was like a spark lighting a fuse. People became curious, drawn into a story they couldn't quite understand but couldn't stop following. The curiosity surrounding him grew, like a quiet storm waiting to break, yet nothing ever seemed to break the surface. What would have become of Viktor Petrov had his empire not been challenged? What would have happened if his methodical rise to power had continued unabated? These questions hang in the air like the thick smoke of a distant fire. His story is one of power in its most subtle form, an invisible empire that touched every corner of Kiev without ever fully revealing itself. But as we look closer into the life of Viktor Petrov, a deeper mystery begins to emerge. The more we learn about this quiet figure, the more we realize that his story isn't just about the rise of a criminal mastermind, it's about a man who managed to outwit a system that seemed invincible, who played the game with such skill that, in the end, no one could ever truly say they knew who he was or what he wanted. This is a story of shadows, of control, and of a man who lived beyond the reach of time itself. In the end, Viktor Petrov's legend isn't just about crime, it's about the allure of the unknown, the pull of the shadows where nothing is ever as it seems. His name may have faded from public memory, but the questions surrounding him still linger in the corners of the underworld. Who was Viktor Petrov, really? And what was the true cost of living in the shadows? His story remains a haunting reminder of the power of secrets, and of how even the most carefully hidden truths can never truly be buried. Viktor Petrov was born into a world that seemed destined to shape him into something darker than the ordinary man. Growing up in Soviet-era Ukraine, his early life was marked by a quiet intensity, an awareness of the harshness that enveloped the country during those years. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was a city of contrasts, a place where culture and history met the cold, suffocating grip of Soviet control. Amid the austerity of Soviet rule, Viktor's childhood unfolded like the pages of a forgotten history, his early years marked by a sharp awareness of the world's cruelties and complexities. In the midst of this oppressive atmosphere, Viktor's family struggled like so many others. The Soviet Union had its grip on every aspect of life, from the most mundane tasks to the grandest aspirations. For the ordinary people, including Viktor's family, survival was an intricate dance of compromise, obedience, and the occasional act of quiet rebellion. Viktor's parents were no different. His father, a factory worker, spent long hours toiling away under the watchful eyes of state officials, while his mother kept the household running with an almost stoic resolve. Like many families at the time, they were simply trying to make it through each day, navigating the undercurrents of Soviet life while trying to carve out small moments of joy. But there was something in Viktor that set him apart from the others. Even as a young boy, he showed a remarkable ability to observe and adapt. He wasn't the loudest or the most outgoing, but his quiet demeanor seemed to draw others to him. It wasn't that he lacked charisma, far from it. Viktor understood the power of silence, of letting others take the stage while he carefully plotted his next move. In the cramped apartment where he and his family lived, surrounded by the ever-present hum of government surveillance, Viktor learned early on how to keep his thoughts and actions hidden beneath the surface, never revealing too much. As he grew older, his awareness of the world around him deepened. The Soviet Union was a place of rigid control, where dissent was crushed under the boot of authority and the KGB kept watch over every citizen. The young Viktor quickly realized that there were two ways to survive in this world, by following the rules, or by bending them to your will. It was in the streets of Kiev, amid the struggles of ordinary people and the occasional rumblings of political unrest, that Viktor began to understand the power dynamics at play. He saw it everywhere, in the way the factory workers exchanged whispered words with one another, in the knowing glances of shopkeepers, in the gestures of authority from the Soviet officials. The city was alive with an energy that was not spoken aloud but understood by those who had learned how to read between the lines. It was this unspoken language of power and control that fascinated Viktor and eventually shaped his future. But it was more than just the need to survive that drove him, it was the desire for something more. Viktor wasn't content to merely exist in the shadows of the Soviet machine. From a young age, he dreamed of mastering the system, of bending the very structures of power to his will. Kiev's underworld was already taking shape, even as the Soviet Union held firm. Criminal groups, though still relatively small, were beginning to carve out their space in the city's dark corners. These early criminal elements weren't yet the large, organized syndicates that would later dominate the post-Soviet landscape, but their influence was already being felt. Viktor became aware of these underground activities early on, seeing the criminals not as threats, but as figures of fascination. They lived by their own rules, outside the purview of the state. And in a world that demanded obedience, there was something deeply alluring about the idea of a life lived beyond the reach of authority. By the time Viktor reached his teenage years, he had developed a keen understanding of the city's power structures, both the visible ones and those hidden beneath the surface. He knew how to move through life without drawing attention to himself, how to make connections without ever exposing his true intentions. It wasn't long before he found himself drawn into the world of petty crime. At first, it was small-time stuff, stealing from markets, picking pockets, running small scams. But even in these early days, Viktor showed a remarkable talent for organization. He had an innate ability to pull people together, to convince them that their collective actions could bring them more power than their individual efforts ever could. There was a quiet intensity about Viktor that made people listen to him, even if he spoke in whispers. He had a way of making others feel that they were part of something larger, that their small actions had meaning in the grand scheme of things. This ability to inspire loyalty and foster trust would serve him well in the years to come. But for now, Viktor was still just a boy, walking the tightrope between youth and adulthood in a city that was constantly on the edge of change. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s changed everything. Kiev, like the rest of Ukraine, was thrown into a period of instability. The old structures of power were crumbling, and the people who had once lived in fear of the KGB now faced the uncertainty of a new, uncharted future. But amidst this chaos, Viktor saw opportunity. The state had lost its grip, and with it, the control it had once held over the people. The vacuum created by the collapse of the Soviet regime was the perfect breeding ground for the kind of criminal activity Viktor had been observing for years. But now, he wasn't just a spectator, he was a player. It was during this tumultuous time that Viktor made his first significant move in the criminal world. He began to form alliances with local criminals, men who shared his understanding of power but lacked his vision. He was quickly becoming a fixture in the city's underworld, though no one yet knew his name. He was still in the shadows, still waiting for the right moment to emerge. But the pieces were falling into place, and Viktor Petrov was poised to become something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. In the years that followed, as Ukraine struggled to redefine itself in the wake of the Soviet collapse, Viktor would quietly, yet decisively, begin to build his empire. It was a slow, deliberate process, one that would require patience, cunning, and an almost uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of everyone else. But the foundations of his future power were being laid in those early years, as he observed, learned, and quietly worked his way into the ranks of the city's most influential, and dangerous, figures. Viktor's path from a quiet observer of Kiev's underworld to a significant player in its shadowy dealings was marked by the kind of strategic thinking and calculated risks that would define his career. As the years passed and Ukraine's political landscape grew more uncertain, Viktor's growing influence could no longer be ignored. He wasn't just another petty criminal or opportunistic street thug, he was beginning to emerge as someone who could shape the criminal landscape, someone whose decisions would ripple through the city's underworld with lasting consequences. His first ventures into more serious crime were nothing spectacular. He didn't rise quickly, nor did he demand the respect that some might expect from someone eager to build a reputation. Instead, Viktor worked behind the scenes, pulling the strings of others and ensuring that everything moved smoothly. He understood that true power didn't lie in grand gestures or violent displays. Instead, it was in the quiet control of people, the manipulation of situations, and the ability to see opportunities that others missed. It was in knowing when to strike and, more importantly, when to wait. Viktor's first significant foray into organized crime was in the field of smuggling. Ukraine, having just gained independence from the Soviet Union, was in the midst of economic disarray. The collapse of the Soviet state meant that borders were no longer tightly controlled, and customs enforcement was a chaotic mess. There was a constant flow of goods, both legal and illegal, moving in and out of the country. Smuggling became a lucrative business, and Viktor, with his sharp mind and natural charisma, was able to tap into this new, unregulated market. At first, Viktor didn't involve himself directly in the physical aspects of the smuggling operations. Instead, he used his growing network of contacts to broker deals, create alliances, and, most importantly, secure the transportation routes. He learned how to navigate the bureaucracy of a country still in the process of defining itself, building connections with corrupt officials and businessmen alike. He understood that the key to making money wasn't just in the goods you transported, it was in who you knew and how well you could protect your interests. But Viktor's rise wasn't without its challenges. He wasn't the only one vying for power in the streets of Kiev. The city's underworld was a complex web of rival factions, each trying to carve out their own slice of the new, post-Soviet world. The more Viktor expanded his operations, the more he attracted the attention of other criminal figures, some of whom weren't content to share. These were dangerous men, hardened by years of survival in a world where betrayal was as common as loyalty was rare. But Viktor knew that every challenge was an opportunity to prove his worth. He wasn't afraid of competition, he thrived on it. His approach was simple: outsmart and outlast. One of his first major confrontations came when a rival gang attempted to muscle in on his smuggling routes. The gang, led by a brash but powerful man named Yuri, the Bull, Kovalenko, had already established control over a large portion of the city's underground economy. They were known for their brutal tactics and their willingness to use violence to get what they wanted. Viktor, however, had no intention of meeting them head-on in a war of attrition. Instead, he opted for a more subtle approach, using his connections to sow distrust within Kovalenko's ranks. He quietly reached out to key figures in Kovalenko's organization, offering them better deals, more security, and more favorable terms than they were receiving under the Bull's leadership. Slowly, one by one, Viktor's quiet influence turned Kovalenko's allies into his own. What began as a small rivalry soon became a game of cat and mouse, with Viktor using his intelligence and patience to outmaneuver Kovalenko at every turn. The war for dominance in the smuggling trade didn't involve any direct confrontation. Instead, it played out in boardrooms and back alleys, where favors were exchanged, debts were paid, or not paid, and trust was both a weapon and a liability. Over time, Kovalenko's grip on power began to loosen. His organization, once a dominant force in Kiev's criminal world, started to unravel, not because of violence or intimidation, but because of Viktor's meticulous strategy and careful manipulation of the power dynamics. By the time Kovalenko realized he was losing control, it was too late. Viktor had already secured the loyalty of most of the gang's key players, and Kovalenko's own supporters were beginning to abandon him. In a final attempt to retain his authority, Kovalenko tried to stage a violent retaliation, but Viktor, always 3 steps ahead, had already orchestrated his fall. The once feared gang leader was arrested under mysterious circumstances, and his organization crumbled in the wake of his sudden disappearance. In the span of a few months, Viktor had gone from being a small-time smuggler to the leader of one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the city. What made Viktor's rise so remarkable wasn't just his strategic brilliance, it was his ability to remain unseen, to stay in the background while those around him fought for the spotlight. His hands were rarely dirty, yet his influence was undeniable. He understood that true power was often invisible. He didn't need to stand in the front of a room or wave a gun to make his presence felt. His name didn't need to be spoken loudly, it was enough that it was whispered in the right circles, by the right people. His reputation spread quietly, like a shadow creeping over the city, and with it, his control over Kiev's criminal world grew. The more Viktor's empire expanded, the more opportunities he saw. He wasn't content with the simple smuggling trade. He began to diversify, moving into more profitable, and more dangerous, ventures. Arms dealing, black market oil trading, and even money laundering became part of his growing criminal portfolio. With each new venture, Viktor proved that his success wasn't a fluke, it was the result of a carefully crafted vision and an unshakable will to dominate. But even as Viktor's empire expanded, he never lost his sense of caution. He knew that in the criminal world, nothing was ever truly secure. Alliances were fleeting, and trust was a currency that could quickly lose its value. Viktor's ability to navigate these shifting landscapes, to build and dismantle relationships at will, was what set him apart from other criminals. He wasn't just a player in the game, he was the one who made the rules. And as his influence spread across Ukraine, one thing became clear: Viktor Petrov wasn't just surviving in the shadows, he was thriving there. Viktor Petrov's ascension to the pinnacle of Kiev's criminal underworld wasn't just the result of clever maneuvering, it was a calculated evolution in a world where power was never static, and alliances could crumble as easily as they were formed. As he strengthened his hold over the city's most profitable illicit enterprises, a shift began to occur within the ranks of those who surrounded him. There was a growing sense that Viktor was no longer simply playing a game of survival, he was building something that transcended the criminal world. His empire wasn't just a patchwork of illegal activities, it was becoming a well-oiled machine that controlled key aspects of the city's economic, political, and social systems. As Viktor's influence expanded, so too did the danger that came with it. He had become more than just a figure in the shadows, he had become a symbol of power, an unseen hand that manipulated everything from the local police force to government officials. But while Viktor operated from behind the scenes, the nature of his power had begun to shift. He was no longer just the strategist or the mastermind, he was becoming a figure of legend, a name spoken in hushed tones in the back rooms of cafes, in the dim-lit alleys of Kiev, and even in the halls of government. His name had become synonymous with control and fear. But Viktor knew that power was fragile. In a world built on betrayal, anyone who grew too confident risked losing everything. It wasn't just his enemies who he needed to watch for, it was the allies who might turn against him when the tide shifted. Even as he consolidated his power, Viktor was always acutely aware that his position was precarious. The more influential he became, the more threats he attracted. This was a reality of the criminal world. Alliances were transient, and loyalty could be bought or sold at the right price. One of the first signs that Viktor's empire was being tested came from an unexpected source, one of his closest allies, Andrei the Wolf Ivanov, a former soldier with deep ties to the city's military elite. Andrei had once been one of Viktor's most trusted lieutenants, a man whose loyalty was never questioned. But as Viktor's power grew, so did Andrei's ambitions. Andrei had his sights set on greater power, and it was becoming clear that he no longer saw Viktor as an untouchable figure. The two had formed an unspoken bond over the years, both understanding that in order to thrive in the lawless world of post-Soviet Ukraine, they needed each other. Viktor had helped Andrei establish a foothold in the underground arms trade, while Andrei had provided Viktor with valuable connections in the military and police forces. It was a symbiotic relationship that had served both men well. But as Viktor's empire reached new heights, Andrei began to chafe under Viktor's influence, sensing that the balance of power was shifting in ways that left him feeling like a mere cog in a much larger machine. Andrei's discontent didn't remain hidden for long. The first indication that something was amiss came when Viktor's operations in the arms trade began to experience inexplicable disruptions. Shipments that had once flowed smoothly began to get delayed, shipments were intercepted by the authorities, and several of Viktor's trusted men were arrested under suspicious circumstances. It wasn't long before Viktor realized that someone within his circle was leaking information to rival factions. The only person who had access to the sensitive details of his operations, and who had the means to disrupt them, was Andrei. Viktor's response was measured, as it always was. He knew that if he acted too quickly, it could trigger an open conflict. The key to maintaining power in a world like this was not in being the most ruthless, it was in being the most strategic. Viktor's next move would determine whether his empire would stand or fall. Viktor didn't confront Andrei directly. Instead, he orchestrated a quiet campaign of isolation. He subtly began to replace Andri's trusted men with his own loyalists, making it difficult for the former soldier to maintain his control over the arms trade. At the same time, Viktor began to tighten his grip on the political and military figures who had once been loyal to Andri. Slowly but surely, Viktor had begun to dismantle Andri's power without ever raising a hand in anger. Andri, realizing that he was losing control, became increasingly desperate. He tried to rally his own supporters, but the more he did so, the more his influence seemed to erode. Viktor's quiet strategy was working. In a final attempt to reassert his dominance, Andri made a fateful mistake. He tried to confront Viktor in a public manner, seeking to humiliate him in front of their mutual contacts in the city's criminal and political circles. But by the time the confrontation took place, Viktor had already positioned himself so effectively that Andri's actions appeared clumsy, rash, and uncalculated. It wasn't long before Andri, the wolf Ivanov, found himself isolated and vulnerable. His network of allies had evaporated, and his reputation had been tarnished. In the end, Viktor didn't need to destroy him outright, he had simply outmaneuvered him at every turn. Andri's fall from grace wasn't a violent showdown, it was a quiet unraveling, a slow, suffocating death by 1,000 small cuts. What Viktor had learned from this conflict was that true power didn't always require direct confrontation. It was about control, subtlety, and knowing when to act and when to wait. He had turned Andri's ambition against him, using it to bring about his downfall without ever shedding a drop of blood. And in doing so, Viktor reinforced the myth of his untouchability. He was a man who could bend others to his will, a man whose every action was part of a greater, invisible design. But the Andri affair wasn't the only threat Viktor had to deal with. As his influence continued to spread across the criminal world of Ukraine, Viktor attracted the attention of far more dangerous and ambitious men. Rivals began to emerge from outside the city, looking to expand their territories into Kiev. These new threats were far less subtle than Andri had been. They were aggressive, willing to use brute force to claim what they wanted. Viktor's next challenge would be different. It wouldn't be a slow game of manipulation and strategy. It would be a test of his ability to fight and survive in a world where violence was often the only language spoken. Yet, as always, Viktor remained calm, focused, and calculating. He knew that every challenge was simply another opportunity to demonstrate his power, to remind the underworld of Kiev who truly held the reins of control. In this world of shifting alliances and constantly rising threats, Viktor understood that the only true constant was his ability to adapt, outthink, and outlast. And with every conflict he weathered, his legend grew, becoming more than just a figure in the shadows, but a symbol of quiet, unstoppable power. Viktor Petrov's empire was now firmly established, and with it came a growing sense of invincibility. But as he expanded his influence further into the heart of Kiev, the challenges he faced became more complex and far-reaching. No longer just dealing with petty criminals and rival gangsters, Viktor now found himself entangled in a much more dangerous game, one that involved the highest echelons of power in Ukraine. It wasn't enough for him to control the streets and the criminal enterprises, he needed to secure his position within the framework of the country's new political reality. The collapse of the Soviet Union had opened up a chaotic space for new power players to emerge, and Viktor understood that in order to thrive, he had to navigate this new world with the same precision he had applied to his criminal empire. Kiev was in the midst of a transformation. The fall of communism had left the country in a state of political flux, with the old order crumbling and the new one still struggling to take shape. In this power vacuum, businessmen and politicians who had once worked under the thumb of Moscow were now positioning themselves to take control of Ukraine's future. Corruption was rife, and the divide between the rich and the poor had never been more pronounced. Amid this chaos, Viktor saw opportunity. He had already established himself as a key player in the city's criminal world, but he knew that true power was not just about wealth or control, it was about influence. And the path to influence in this new Ukraine ran straight through the corridors of power in Kiev's political elite. Viktor's early interactions with the government were subtle. He began by forging alliances with local politicians, those who had emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet system and were now trying to secure their positions in a rapidly changing world. These politicians were eager for support, and Viktor, with his deep knowledge of the city's inner workings, was more than willing to offer them what they needed: money, muscle, and the ability to move goods and people across borders without the interference of the authorities. In exchange, he asked for one thing: protection. Viktor knew that in the volatile world of post-Soviet Ukraine, nothing was secure unless it was backed by political power. One of his earliest allies in this political game was Mikhail Volkov, a former KGB officer who had seamlessly transitioned into a position of influence in the newly formed Ukrainian government. Volkov, known for his ruthless methods during the Soviet era, had quickly become a key figure in Kiev's political scene. He was well connected and had an unshakable grip on several sectors of the economy, particularly in industries like oil, gas, and telecommunications. Volkov's power was undeniable, and Viktor understood that aligning himself with the former KGB officer would give him access to resources and political protection that no amount of brute force could provide. The partnership between Viktor and Volkov was one of necessity and mutual benefit. Volkov needed Viktor's criminal network to help him secure key industries, and Viktor needed Volkov's political backing to ensure that his operations ran smoothly without interference from law enforcement or rival factions. The two men struck an unspoken deal, one that would be cemented through a series of quiet transactions and behind-the-scenes negotiations. In a country where the lines between business, politics, and crime were often blurred, their alliance made perfect sense. Viktor was no longer just a figure in the criminal underworld, he was becoming a shadow advisor, a key player who could move the pieces on the board from the safety of the darkness. However, Viktor's involvement in the political sphere came with its own set of risks. Volkov's enemies were many, and Viktor soon found himself caught up in a deadly game of political maneuvering, where betrayal and deception were the currency. Rivals within the government and business elite began to take notice of Viktor's growing influence and the alliance between him and Volkov. As Viktor's name began to circulate among the country's most powerful figures, it was clear that his presence was no longer limited to the streets of Kiev, he was now a player in the higher echelons of power. One of the first signs of trouble came when a rival political faction, led by the ambitious Andriy Shevchenko, began to challenge Volkov's position. Shevchenko, a charismatic and ruthless former military officer, had long resented Volkov's influence over Kiev's political and economic landscape. Unlike Volkov, who had built his power quietly, Shevchenko was a man of action. He wasn't content with behind-the-scenes dealings and political alliances. He wanted control, and he was willing to use any means necessary to seize it. Shevchenko's first move was to target Viktor. He knew that Viktor was the key to Volkov's influence, and if he could eliminate him, he could weaken Volkov's grip on the city. But Viktor wasn't an easy target. He had learned long ago that survival in the criminal world depended on one's ability to stay hidden, to remain unpredictable. Shevchenko, however, underestimated Viktor's resilience. Rather than confront Viktor directly, Shevchenko used more subtle methods, attempting to undermine his operations and sow discord among his allies. For months, Shevchenko tried to infiltrate Viktor's organization, using a combination of bribes, threats, and double-crosses to turn key members of Viktor's inner circle against him. He spread rumors, planted false information, and even tried to turn Viktor's allies in the government against him. But Viktor, ever the strategist, was always one step ahead. He had already anticipated Shevchenko's moves and had begun to counter them long before they took shape. By the time Shevchenko made his move, Viktor had already neutralized the threats, turning many of Shevchenko's own allies against him in a brilliant game of subterfuge. Shevchenko's attempt to destroy Viktor ended in failure. In the wake of his defeat, Viktor's reputation only grew stronger. His ability to outthink his enemies and stay in control, even when his life was at risk, became the stuff of legend. And as his power continued to grow, so did the complexity of the challenges he faced. Viktor was no longer just a criminal mastermind, he was a man who could shape the future of an entire nation, a man whose influence reached far beyond the streets of Kiev. With each new challenge, Viktor became more than just a survivor of the criminal world. He was the architect of his own destiny, a man whose influence could change the course of history. As he navigated the treacherous waters of Ukraine's political and criminal elite, Viktor's empire grew, and with it, his ability to control not just the streets, but the very institutions that governed the country. The balance of power in Ukraine had shifted, and Viktor Petrov was at the center of it all. Viktor Petrov's grip on Kiev's criminal underworld was now so firm that it seemed almost unshakable. His reputation, once built on subtlety and quiet manipulation, had grown to legendary proportions. He wasn't just a man who controlled the flow of goods, people, and information, he had become a figure of myth, whispered about in the alleys and boardrooms of Kiev alike. But for Viktor, the price of power was becoming ever more apparent. As his influence spread into the political and economic spheres, the challenges he faced became increasingly complex. He was no longer simply battling rival gangs or corrupt officials, he was now tangled in a web of international intrigue, foreign powers, and political maneuvering that threatened to destabilize everything he had worked so hard to build. The first signs of trouble came from an unexpected source, a powerful new international syndicate with ties to the Russian mafia. These men, more ruthless and more sophisticated than anything Viktor had ever encountered, were beginning to make moves into Ukraine, seeking to capitalize on the instability that had followed the fall of the Soviet Union. The syndicate, known only as the Circle, had established a reputation for being able to operate in multiple countries with a level of efficiency and brutality that made them nearly untouchable. They had connections in the highest levels of government, military, and business, and they were looking to expand their reach into Ukraine, specifically into Kiev. Viktor had heard whispers about the Circle for years, but he had always dismissed them as just another group of opportunistic criminals. But when he started to see their influence creeping into his city, he realized that he had underestimated them. The Circle's approach was different from the rough-and-tumble methods that had made Viktor successful. They were more patient, more calculating, and they understood the intricacies of international business in a way that Viktor had never had to. They were, in many ways, the future of organized crime, operating on a scale far larger than anything Viktor had ever encountered. The first encounter between Viktor's empire and the Circle took place over a shipment of weapons that had been intercepted on its way through Ukraine. Viktor had long controlled the arms trade in the region, ensuring that weapons moved across the border with little interference from law enforcement. But one particular shipment, bound for a client in Eastern Europe, was seized by a mysterious group that Viktor quickly learned was connected to the Circle. The message was clear: they were moving into his territory, and they weren't afraid to use force to make their presence known. For Viktor, this was a direct challenge, one he couldn't ignore. The Circle's reach was vast, and their methods were unlike anything he had encountered. They had access to advanced technology, sophisticated intelligence networks, and, most troubling of all, they had the backing of influential figures both inside and outside Ukraine. But Viktor wasn't a man to back down easily. He had faced challenges before, and he had always emerged victorious. However, this new adversary posed a different kind of threat, one that couldn't be dealt with through brute force or political manipulation alone. Viktor's first move was to gather intelligence on the Circle, to learn who they were, what they wanted, and how they operated. He knew that the only way to defeat an enemy like this was to understand them completely. Viktor's network of informants spread across Ukraine, and he quickly used his connections to gain access to the circles of power in Russia and Eastern Europe. Slowly, he began to piece together a picture of the Circle, its leaders, its structure, and its goals. But as he dug deeper, Viktor realized that the Circle wasn't just a criminal organization, it was part of something far larger. Their operations spanned multiple countries, and their influence reached into the very heart of global politics and economics. The more Viktor learned, the more he understood that this wasn't just a battle for control of the arms trade, it was a battle for control of Ukraine itself. The Circle, with its vast resources and international connections, was looking to establish a foothold in Kiev, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. This wasn't just about profit, it was about reshaping the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Viktor knew that he needed to act fast. The longer he waited, the more control he would lose. He couldn't afford to let the circle take root in his city. But he also knew that going up against such a powerful enemy head-on would be suicidal. So, as he always did, Viktor bided his time. He began to quietly disrupt the circle's operations in Ukraine, using his network to feed them false information, delay their shipments, and sabotage their plans. He knew that he couldn't defeat them outright in one fell swoop, but he could make their operations so difficult that they would begin to question whether it was worth continuing their efforts in Kiev. At the same time, Viktor also started to work on shoring up his own alliances. The circle was powerful, but Viktor knew that he couldn't win this battle alone. He needed to consolidate his hold over the local power structures, ensuring that key figures in the police, military, and government were firmly in his corner. He also reached out to his old allies in the Russian underworld, attempting to form a counter-alliance to the circle's growing influence. The game had changed, and Viktor knew that if he was going to survive, he needed to play on a global scale. But despite his best efforts, the circle's presence in Ukraine grew stronger. They were relentless, and their resources seemed endless. They began to target Viktor's most trusted allies, using both financial pressure and intimidation to turn them against him. Viktor's carefully constructed web of power began to fray, and for the first time in years, he found himself fighting on multiple fronts. The circle's men moved through Kiev like ghosts, their operations operating in the shadows, while Viktor was forced to defend his empire against attacks from all sides. It wasn't long before Viktor realized that he had underestimated his enemy. The circle wasn't just a criminal organization, they were a well-oiled machine, and they had the means to outlast him if given the opportunity. In the midst of this escalating battle, Viktor was faced with an even more troubling realization: the circle was no longer just a rival, they were a direct threat to his survival. If he didn't act decisively, his empire would collapse. In the weeks that followed, Viktor did what he did best: he adapted. He began to recruit new allies, form new alliances, and develop strategies to counter the circle's influence. The battle for control of Kiev's underworld was no longer just about criminal enterprises, it had become a high-stakes geopolitical game. As the two forces prepared for their final confrontation, Viktor knew that the outcome of this battle would determine not only the future of his empire but the future of Ukraine itself. Viktor Petrov's empire had weathered countless storms, but the rise of the circle posed a threat unlike anything he had ever faced. The delicate balance of power he had carefully cultivated over the years was now in jeopardy, and he knew that he had to act with both caution and precision. The circle was not only well-funded and strategically positioned, but it also had an aura of invincibility, something that Viktor had rarely encountered in his own rise to power. As he prepared to confront this new enemy, he realized that he needed to think differently. This would not be a battle that could be won through brute force or covert political maneuvering alone. The stakes were much higher now, and Viktor understood that he had to find a way to outmaneuver the circle before they could dismantle his empire piece by piece. His first step was to assess the situation with a cool head. Viktor had always been a master of strategy, and he knew that in moments of extreme pressure, the key to survival was maintaining control over his own emotions. He gathered his most trusted lieutenants, men and women who had been with him since the early days of his rise. Together, they sat in a dimly lit room at his compound, a nondescript building on the outskirts of Kiev, away from the prying eyes of the city's elite. Here, behind closed doors, Viktor outlined the gravity of the situation, stressing that the war with the circle would be unlike anything they had faced before. The circle, Viktor explained, was a transnational criminal network with its roots deeply embedded in Russia and Eastern Europe. They were not just a threat to his criminal enterprises, they were a threat to his entire way of life. The circle's influence stretched far beyond Kiev, with connections to politicians, oligarchs, and even intelligence agencies. Their operations were slick and sophisticated, designed to infiltrate and control rather than simply destroy. And as Viktor's lieutenants nodded grimly, he made one thing clear: the circle had to be neutralized, not just defeated. To survive this war, he would have to think and act on a global scale. The first major move Viktor made was to set up a series of covert operations designed to infiltrate the Circle's networks. His spies, some of whom had been embedded in the Russian underworld for years, were tasked with gathering intelligence on the Circle's leadership structure, their financial backers, and their key operations in Ukraine. Viktor's men worked in the shadows, tracking movements, intercepting communications, and gaining access to the financial records that could give them insight into the syndicate's operations. It wasn't just about knowing where their shipments were going or who their partners were, it was about uncovering the hidden strings that pulled the Circle's power into motion. At the same time, Viktor doubled down on his influence within the Ukrainian government. He knew that to confront the Circle, he would need more than just street-level power. He needed the backing of the state itself. For years, Viktor had maintained a delicate network of relationships with corrupt officials, but now he needed to solidify his position among the upper echelons of government. He began to leverage his political contacts, making discreet overtures to key figures in both the military and the political establishment. He promised protection, financial support, and a share of his future spoils if they stood by him in the coming war. With Ukraine's government teetering between chaos and opportunity, Viktor understood that his best chance of survival lay in securing political backing from the very people who controlled the nation's destiny. As the weeks went by, Viktor's preparations were met with mixed results. While he had made significant progress in gathering intelligence on the Circle, his attempts to secure additional political support were met with resistance. Many of the government officials he approached were wary of becoming entangled with someone of Viktor's reputation. The country's fragile political situation made many hesitant to take sides, and the prospect of crossing the Circle's far-reaching network of allies was not something to be taken lightly. Despite his wealth and influence, Viktor found that the political landscape of post-Soviet Ukraine was a labyrinth of competing factions, each with its own ambitions and interests. Meanwhile, the Circle had begun to tighten its grip on Kiev. They made their presence felt not through violence or overt displays of power, but through subtlety and strategic alliances. They began to infiltrate local businesses, taking control of critical industries such as energy, transportation, and telecommunications. They leveraged their connections to win government contracts and gained favor with the country's emerging oligarchs, who were eager to align themselves with such a powerful syndicate. Viktor, meanwhile, was increasingly marginalized from the corridors of power, his influence in decline as the Circle's operations flourished unchecked. It was clear that Viktor's old methods, of operating in the shadows and making covert deals, were no longer enough to maintain his hold on Kiev. He needed to make a statement, a move that would send a clear message to the Circle and to anyone else who might be watching. In the world of organized crime, action spoke louder than words, and Viktor understood that if he was to regain control of his destiny, he had to act decisively. His plan was simple: hit the Circle where it would hurt the most, its financial operations. Viktor knew that the syndicate's vast network of businesses and assets was its lifeblood. If he could disrupt their cash flow, he could weaken their position and force them into a vulnerable position. The first target was one of the Circle's key front companies, a transportation company that was responsible for moving goods across Ukraine and into neighboring countries. Viktor's men infiltrated the company's operations, planting false documents, delaying shipments, and causing disruptions in their supply chain. The damage wasn't immediately visible, but over time, the cost of these disruptions began to mount, and the Circle found itself facing logistical problems that it hadn't anticipated. But Viktor's strategy wasn't limited to just one company. He began to target other areas of the Circle's operations, smuggling routes, financial laundering operations, and even their connections with local law enforcement. Slowly but surely, he started to dismantle their operations piece by piece, disrupting their carefully orchestrated web of influence. While the Circle was distracted by these small, seemingly isolated problems, Viktor was laying the groundwork for something much larger. He knew that in order to defeat the Circle, he needed to create chaos. He needed them to lose control of their own operations before he could strike a final, decisive blow. The tide of the battle began to shift. Viktor's ability to disrupt the Circle's operations, combined with his continued efforts to solidify his political alliances, began to pay off. The Circle, once so confident in its control over Kiev, now found itself on the defensive. But Viktor knew that the war was far from over. Every move he made was a calculated risk, and he had to remain vigilant. One misstep could lead to disaster, and he was fully aware that the Circle's retaliation would come soon. With each passing day, the stakes grew higher, and the game became more dangerous. But Viktor had no intention of losing. He had already outlasted every challenge that had come his way. And he would do whatever it took to ensure that his empire would remain standing. Viktor Petrov had come to understand that in the game of power, the rules were always shifting. One moment, it seemed like he was on top of the world, his criminal empire stretching its influence across borders and beyond. The next, the ground was slipping from beneath him as the Circle, an international syndicate with power far beyond his own reach, began to move in on his territory. It wasn't just an attack, it was a calculated strategy designed to erode everything Viktor had spent years building. As Viktor continued to weaken the Circle's operations, he knew that the battle was far from won. Every move had to be carefully calculated, there was no room for error. He had already made enemies within his own ranks, people who feared that his increasingly bold maneuvers were leading them down a dangerous path. But Viktor wasn't the type to be deterred. His mind was sharp, and his ability to adapt had allowed him to stay a step ahead of his adversaries for years. Yet, as he prepared for the final confrontation, he had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of this war would be. The Circle was playing a game at a different level. Their strategy wasn't just based on the criminal underworld, it was entwined with politics, business, and covert international operations. While Viktor's network remained robust within Ukraine, the Circle's operations were global. They controlled pipelines, stock markets, and underground trade routes that spanned across Europe and into Asia. The fact that they had already begun to take root in Ukraine was a testament to the fact that they had deep pockets and even deeper connections. Viktor's efforts to destabilize their financial operations had been partially successful, but the damage he inflicted on their business empire only seemed to drive them further underground, making them even more elusive and unpredictable. Yet the real shock came when Viktor's own inner circle began to show signs of fractures. It wasn't just the Circle that posed a danger to his empire now, it was also the cracks in his own organization. Viktor had always been able to rely on loyalty, the men and women around him were more than just allies, they were like family. But as his campaign against the Circle escalated, so did the pressure. The whispers began. He could feel the tension simmering just below the surface. There were rumors, unspoken fears among his top lieutenants that Viktor's ambition was starting to become a liability. They feared that the war against the Circle would be the end of them all. Some were already thinking about their futures, what would happen if Viktor lost? They couldn't afford to risk everything for a lost cause. This realization hit Viktor like a wave, but he was no stranger to betrayal. He had been betrayed before, by those closest to him, and he had always emerged from it stronger. Yet this time, the betrayal was coming from within his ranks, not from external enemies. The very people who had stood by his side for years were beginning to question their loyalty. Viktor knew that something had to change. He couldn't afford to fight a two-front war, one against the Circle, and another against the very people who had helped him build his empire. He had to restore order within his own ranks and remind them who was in control. Viktor's response was swift. He began holding private meetings with his closest advisors, one by one, gathering them in his private office, the walls lined with maps, photographs, and files detailing the operations of both his empire and the Circle's. He listened carefully to their concerns, but he also made it clear that betrayal would not be tolerated. He spoke of loyalty, of the vision they had shared, and of the sacrifices they had all made to get to where they were now. He reminded them that his leadership had always been the reason they had survived the bloodshed, the losses, and the constant threats. He assured them that the war with the Circle was not a battle for survival, it was a battle for control of their future. Gradually, his stern reassurances began to calm the nerves of his men. But there was something else that Viktor understood now, something he hadn't fully grasped before. The Circle wasn't just a group of criminals trying to take over his territory. They were a threat to his vision of power itself. If the Circle succeeded in taking control of Ukraine, Viktor's empire would crumble, and with it, everything he had worked for. He couldn't afford to let them take the country's destiny into their hands. This was no longer just about money or territory, it was about shaping the future. Viktor was fighting not only for control of the underworld but for the very soul of Ukraine. It was at this point that Viktor made his boldest move yet. He reached out to a few trusted contacts within the highest echelons of Ukrainian government, individuals who had long benefited from his empire but had stayed silent on the fringes of power. He knew that the Circle's influence was beginning to reach into political spheres, and he couldn't afford to let them gain control of the state. These political figures, while not as powerful as those behind the Circle, held sway over critical parts of Ukraine's infrastructure. Viktor made it clear that they needed to choose a side. He could offer them security, wealth, and influence if they aligned themselves with his cause. But if they chose to side with the Circle, he warned them, they would be branded as enemies, and he would not hesitate to bring them down. It was a gamble. These individuals were not easily swayed, and the pressure from the Circle was immense. But Viktor's tactics were always effective when he played to the greed and ambition of those around him. Over time, one by one, several high-ranking officials pledged their allegiance to Viktor. It wasn't the political victory he had hoped for, but it was enough to tip the balance in his favor. With these new allies in place, Viktor now had a foothold in the corridors of power that the Circle could not easily infiltrate. He had positioned himself not just as a mob boss, but as a key player in the larger political game that was unfolding across Ukraine. Still, Viktor knew that the Circle was a formidable enemy, and the final battle was still ahead. The war for Kiev's underworld had reached a fever pitch, and Viktor's moves were now more calculated than ever. He was playing a long game, and every decision, every alliance, every act of sabotage against the Circle's operations, had to be part of a larger strategy. His men, once uncertain, were beginning to rally around him again, their loyalty restored. Viktor had faced betrayal before, but never quite like this. Now, with the political pieces in place and his power base intact, he was ready for the final showdown. It would be a battle not just for his empire, but for the very future of Ukraine itself. Viktor Petrov knew that the war against the Circle was far from over, but as the months passed, he began to sense a shift in the tide. The fragile alliances he had forged with political figures, military leaders, and influential businessmen were starting to solidify, providing him with the leverage he needed to challenge his enemies on a larger scale. The Circle, once so untouchable, was now facing cracks in its armor. Viktor's campaign of disruption had begun to take its toll on their operations, and although their reach extended far beyond Ukraine, their grip on the country's most valuable assets had begun to loosen. Still, Viktor's position was precarious. Every move he made was a calculated risk, and he could feel the growing weight of his actions bearing down on him. He had stepped into a world where alliances were constantly shifting, and loyalty was a commodity that was in short supply. Despite the success he had found in infiltrating the Circle's operations, he could not ignore the danger that lurked around every corner. His men were loyal, but even they were beginning to question the cost of the war. The prolonged struggle was exhausting, and with each passing day, the stakes seemed to grow higher. There was no telling how long they could maintain their momentum before the weight of their ambitions dragged them all down. The situation became even more complicated when Viktor discovered that the Circle was not operating alone. Their network stretched far beyond the borders of Ukraine, reaching into the halls of power in Russia, Europe, and even further abroad. It wasn't just money and influence they controlled, it was the very infrastructure of the criminal world. Smuggling routes, arms deals, human trafficking rings, and cybercrimes all fell under the Circle's umbrella. Viktor had always known that his rivals were powerful, but he hadn't realized the full extent of their global reach until now. The scope of their operations was staggering, and for the first time in his career, Viktor felt the pressure of fighting a battle on multiple fronts. As he continued to strategize, Viktor found that his efforts to undermine the Circle's financial power were not enough to bring them to their knees. While the sabotage of their Ukrainian operations had caused significant disruptions, the Circle had quickly adapted, shifting their operations to other parts of Eastern Europe and beyond. Viktor realized that in order to truly cripple them, he would need to strike at the heart of their operation, hit them where it hurt the most. But that was easier said than done. The Circle's leadership was shrouded in mystery, and Viktor had no clear way of reaching them directly. He knew that to defeat them, he needed to disrupt their leadership structure, dismantle their coordination, and create enough chaos within their ranks to make them implode. But how could he achieve this when the Circle's leaders were scattered across the globe, operating in the shadows and rarely making direct contact with anyone outside of their inner circle? Viktor's spies, who had provided him with invaluable intelligence over the years, were now tasked with finding a way to get closer to the true power brokers behind the Circle. As Viktor pondered his next move, he also began to see the true cost of the war on his own organization. His lieutenants, while still loyal, were beginning to show signs of fatigue. The constant pressure, the need to stay one step ahead of the Circle, and the weight of Viktor's escalating ambition were taking their toll. There were whispers again, this time not just about the Circle's reach, but about Viktor's own state of mind. His obsession with victory was becoming apparent, and while it had served him well in the past, it was now starting to strain his relationships with those closest to him. Viktor had always been a calculated, level-headed leader, but the constant threat to his empire was changing him. The cool, composed strategist was beginning to show signs of vulnerability, and his men could see it. Despite these internal tensions, Viktor remained determined to win this war, no matter the cost. His mind was always racing, calculating the best way to exploit the Circle's weaknesses. He began to formulate a new plan, a more audacious strategy that would not just disrupt the Circle's operations but shake them to their very core. It was risky, perhaps more so than anything he had attempted before, but Viktor was a man who had never shied away from a challenge. If anything, the pressure only sharpened his resolve. He called together his most trusted lieutenants to discuss his new plan. They gathered in the same dimly lit room where they had met so many times before, the walls heavy with the weight of their past decisions. Viktor stood before them, his mind focused and his eyes sharp as he laid out the details of his vision. His plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. He would target the supply lines that ran through Eastern Europe, the same ones that the Circle relied on to transport their goods, their weapons, and their illicit contraband. By cutting off their access to these routes, Viktor hoped to isolate the Circle's operations and make them more vulnerable to attack. But the true brilliance of his plan lay in his understanding of the Circle's leadership. Viktor believed that if he could disrupt their supply lines, he could force them to reveal their true vulnerabilities. The Circle, after all, was not just a collection of criminals, it was a well-organized and disciplined operation, one that relied on secrecy and compartmentalization to function. If Viktor could break their logistical network, it would force their leaders to come together to address the crisis, which would give him the opportunity to strike at the heart of their power. As Viktor explained his plan, his lieutenants listened intently, their faces a mixture of concern and intrigue. They knew the risks involved, but they also understood the stakes. This was their chance to strike a blow that could cripple the Circle and give Viktor the upper hand he needed to finally take control. The plan was audacious, but it was the only option left. With his new strategy in place, Viktor set to work. His network of spies and operatives in Eastern Europe began to mobilize, setting the groundwork for the sabotage of the Circle's supply routes. At the same time, Viktor continued to solidify his political alliances in Ukraine, ensuring that he had the backing he needed to survive any retaliation from the Circle. The stakes were higher than ever, but Viktor was no longer just playing for control of his empire, he was playing for the future of Ukraine itself. The stakes had never been so high, and the danger never so imminent. As the final pieces of his plan fell into place, Viktor prepared himself for the inevitable conflict that would come. He knew that the Circle would not take this attack lying down, and that they would retaliate with everything they had. But Viktor had always been a survivor, and he was prepared to see this battle through to its bitter end. The war was about to reach its climax, and no matter what happened, Viktor knew that he could never turn back. His legacy, his empire, and the future of Ukraine itself were all hanging in the balance. The atmosphere in Kiev grew tense as Viktor Petrov's plan began to take shape. Every move, every strategy, and every detail had to be meticulously calculated. The war with the Circle had reached a critical point, and there was no turning back. Viktor's men were on edge, each operation carrying the weight of their future. His lieutenants, once skeptical of his bold ambitions, now followed him with unwavering loyalty, though a quiet undercurrent of fear ran through them. Fear of failure. Fear of retaliation. And most of all, fear of the unknown. The Circle, like a shadowy specter, was far from defeated. Viktor had struck them hard, but their reach was vast, and their resilience was unmatched. The first phase of his plan was already underway, disrupting the Circle's vital supply lines in Eastern Europe. This was no small feat. The routes were heavily guarded, both physically and politically. Smuggling operations, arms trafficking, and various illegal trades flowed through these channels, and disrupting them would send ripples through the entire network. Viktor's operatives were deep in the field, infiltrating key transit points, sabotaging shipments, and causing chaos in places where the Circle's influence was most concentrated. It was a delicate operation, and Viktor knew that one wrong move could trigger a brutal retaliation. Yet, as the first reports of success trickled in, Viktor realized that the Circle wasn't reacting the way he had expected. Instead of retaliating aggressively, they seemed to withdraw, tightening their operations and pulling back into the shadows. Viktor had anticipated an all-out war, but what he got instead was a quiet retreat. The silence was unnerving. Viktor couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on beneath the surface, something he couldn't see yet. The Circle's ability to adapt was one of the reasons they had become such a formidable force in the criminal world. But this new development unsettled him. Why were they not striking back with the full force of their resources? Viktor, always the strategist, knew that the next move would be crucial. He had to keep the pressure on them, but he couldn't afford to make a misstep. If the Circle was regrouping, then there was something larger at play. He could sense it. Viktor called a meeting with his closest advisors, urging them to remain vigilant. He wanted to know everything about the Circle's movements, their leadership, their alliances, anything that could give him the edge. His men had begun to uncover small details, inconsistencies in the Circle's operations, but nothing concrete. It felt as though the organization was operating under a veil, invisible even to his most trusted spies. Days turned into weeks, and the tension only increased. Viktor's empire had never been stronger. His influence in Ukraine was at an all-time high, and his connections with powerful political figures ensured that his position remained secure. However, with every victory, the pressure mounted. His enemies, both inside and outside his organization, were beginning to circle like vultures. Viktor's ambition had always been his greatest strength, but it was also starting to alienate those closest to him. His lieutenants, who had once followed him with blind loyalty, now began to question the cost of this endless war. Some whispered that Viktor's obsession with defeating the Circle had turned him into a man they no longer recognized. The calm, calculating leader they had once admired was now a shadow of his former self, consumed by the need for power and control. As the war continued, Viktor began to feel the strain. His mind, once sharp and focused, was now clouded by doubt. His usual confidence had been replaced by an unsettling sense of paranoia. He couldn't shake the feeling that there were forces working against him within his own ranks. It wasn't just the betrayal that had shaken him, it was the growing sense that his empire was slipping out of his grasp. The more he thought about the Circle's retreat, the more he realized that it could be a strategy to lure him into a trap. Viktor's paranoia grew with each passing day. He began to isolate himself from his lieutenants, preferring to work alone, trusting no one completely. His nightly routine changed as well. Where once he would have met with trusted allies over dinner, discussing strategy and operations, he now sat alone in his office, poring over maps and reports late into the night. The hum of his computer, the scratching of his pen on paper, became his only companions. The once vibrant, bustling operations were now conducted in silence, with Viktor taking full control of each move. His men, unsure of what had become of their leader, began to feel the weight of the uncertainty. Then, a breakthrough came. A source within the circle, one of Viktor's most trusted informants, sent him a message: "They know what you're doing. They've always known." The cryptic message was accompanied by a set of coordinates, and Viktor immediately understood what it meant. The circle had been one step ahead of him all along. They had been playing a game of deception, allowing Viktor to think he was winning while silently maneuvering to trap him. It was a message meant to send Viktor a clear warning: they were not as vulnerable as he had assumed. The realization hit Viktor like a cold wave. The circle had always operated with patience, carefully setting up their moves, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their withdrawal had been part of a larger plan to lull him into a false sense of security. And now, they were about to close in. Viktor knew that if he didn't act fast, everything he had worked for could be lost. Determined to regain control, Viktor called his closest allies together once more. This time, there would be no hesitation. There could be no more room for doubt. The time had come to strike, but Viktor understood that he needed more than just brute force. He needed to outsmart the circle, to anticipate their next move before they made it. He would take the fight to their door, disrupting their plans from within. As his men gathered around him, Viktor shared his new vision. They would infiltrate the very heart of the circle's operation, targeting their leadership. He believed that if he could eliminate their top members, disrupt their communications, and destabilize their core, the rest of the organization would crumble. But this mission was not without risks. It would take everything Viktor had: his intellect, his resources, and most of all, his ability to manipulate those around him. The plan was risky. It involved going deep into the circle's territory, where betrayal was as common as breathing. Viktor knew the dangers, but the stakes were now higher than ever. He had no choice but to act swiftly and decisively. As his operatives prepared for the mission, Viktor remained calm on the surface, though inside, a storm raged. He knew that the final confrontation with the circle was inevitable. It was a battle for control of more than just the underworld. It was a battle for the future of Ukraine itself. The outcome of this war would decide everything. Would Viktor emerge victorious, or would he fall victim to the very paranoia that had consumed him? Only time would tell. The mission was set in motion. Viktor Petrov had never been one to act impulsively, but now the situation demanded swift action. He understood the risks, the unknowns that lurked in the shadows. The circle was a beast unlike any other, a secretive empire that had weathered more storms than Viktor could count. But now, after months of playing their game, it was time for Viktor to control the board. His men were ready, and the plan was simple: infiltrate the heart of the circle's operations, strike at the leadership, and leave them crippled. But simplicity, Viktor knew, often belied the danger. As his trusted operatives set out to execute the plan, Viktor's thoughts were consumed by the enormity of the task ahead. The circle had eyes everywhere, and their ability to detect threats before they materialized was legendary. They had orchestrated a web of deception so intricate that even Viktor's most seasoned spies could only scratch the surface of its true complexity. The circle's network spanned across Europe, Russia, and even reached into the United States. The risk of exposure was high, and the consequences of failure even higher. But Viktor had already come too far to turn back. The plan to infiltrate the circle's inner sanctum had been in the works for weeks. Viktor's team had gathered intelligence from every possible angle, piecing together fragments of information like a jigsaw puzzle. They had learned about the various factions within the circle, the power struggles, the key players, and their vulnerabilities. But despite the wealth of information, Viktor knew that the real challenge lay in getting close enough to deal the final blow. The key to success would be the element of surprise. Viktor's men had embedded themselves in various positions within the circle's supply chain, blending in with their operations. For months, they had been laying low, biding their time until the right moment came. And now, with that moment upon them, everything hinged on one thing: timing. Viktor's lieutenants, each with their own set of skills, had carefully coordinated their moves. One team would target the Circle's primary operations hub, a heavily guarded compound nestled in the mountains of Eastern Europe. Another would work to disable their communication network, preventing any form of organized response from their leadership. The final team would focus on neutralizing key figures within the Circle, those whose influence held the organization together. These were the men who controlled the flow of money, weapons, and information. Eliminating them would create chaos and confusion, disrupting the organization's entire structure. But Viktor's mind was not on the operation itself. Instead, he was preoccupied with something far more personal. The Circle had been watching him for years, and he knew they were not simply going to sit back and let him take control. They had already demonstrated their ability to manipulate and deceive, and Viktor was certain they would try to turn his own strategies against him. For the first time, Viktor questioned the loyalty of his own men. Were they truly as loyal as they seemed? Or had he been too consumed by his own ambitions to see the cracks in his empire? Despite his growing doubts, Viktor couldn't afford to let fear cloud his judgment. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed brought him closer to the final confrontation. His operatives were in place, the leadership of the Circle was within reach, and all that remained was to execute the plan with precision. There could be no mistakes. Any hesitation could cost them everything. As Viktor paced through the dimly lit corridors of his headquarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The usual hum of activity, the busy chatter of his lieutenants discussing strategy, seemed distant, almost hollow. There was a sense of unease in the air, as if everyone knew the stakes were higher than ever before. And in that silence, Viktor heard a voice in his head, one he had not heard in years, the voice of his father. The same man who had taught him the ruthless ways of the criminal world, but also instilled in him a sense of honor that Viktor had long since cast aside. "Trust no one, Viktor," his father's voice echoed in his memory. "In this world, the moment you trust someone, you lose." Viktor paused, his breath catching in his throat. His father's words, which had once seemed like distant, archaic advice, now rang louder than ever. For a fleeting moment, Viktor wondered if his own descent into paranoia had been the very thing that would destroy him. Perhaps, in his hunger for power, he had already lost sight of everything that had made him a leader. Maybe it wasn't the Circle that he needed to worry about. Maybe it was the men closest to him, the very people he had relied on, trusted, and built his empire with. Had he pushed them too far? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was a sharp, measured sound, one that immediately snapped Viktor out of his reverie. He looked up to find one of his most trusted lieutenants, Arkady, standing in the doorway. Arkady was a seasoned operative, loyal to the core, but even Viktor knew that loyalty in this world was a fragile thing. Arkady's face was grim, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" Viktor asked, his voice colder than he intended. Arkady stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "The operation is ready. We go in an hour." But, Viktor's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it spoken aloud was a different matter entirely. "But what?" Viktor pressed, his mind racing. "Something doesn't feel right," Arkady said quietly, his voice low. "I've been getting whispers. There are rumors within the ranks. Some of the men are hesitant. They're talking about a mole inside our operation. A leak. If they know what we're doing, the whole plan could fall apart before we even get started." The words hung heavy in the air. Viktor felt the tension in his chest tighten. This was exactly what he had feared, the betrayal of his own men. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He had known that paranoia could be dangerous, but this was different. If there was a mole within his ranks, the entire operation could be compromised. "I need you to verify this," Viktor finally said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. "We cannot afford to be caught off guard." Arkady nodded. "I'll handle it personally. We'll have the mole exposed by the time the operation begins." Viktor exhaled slowly, his mind now occupied with two things, the imminent operation and the looming question of loyalty. He had built his empire on trust and fear, but now it seemed that both were slipping through his fingers. Would the men he had spent years cultivating as his closest allies be the ones to betray him at the final hour? As Viktor looked out the window, watching the city of Kiev stretch out before him, he realized that the battle for control of the circle was more than just a fight for power, it was a fight for his own survival. The next few hours would determine whether he would emerge victorious or be consumed by the very empire he had created. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome was still uncertain. The clock was ticking, and Viktor Petrov could feel the weight of every passing second. His operatives were already in motion, their tasks set in stone, and yet a gnawing anxiety clawed at him. The plan to strike the circle was no longer just a strategic move, it had become a matter of survival. As the hours dwindled, Viktor's mind kept returning to one singular thought: what if Arkady was right? What if there was a mole, someone among them who had tipped off the circle and rendered everything they had worked for a moot effort? The suspicion lingered, unfurling like a dark cloud in Viktor's thoughts, threatening to swallow his resolve. Arkady had gone to work immediately, scouring the ranks of Viktor's inner circle, looking for any signs of betrayal. Viktor trusted Arkady more than most, but even he wasn't immune to the temptation of greed, power, or fear. The same could be said for the rest of the men who had sworn loyalty to Viktor. He had always known that loyalty, in the world they lived in, was a fragile thing, a fleeting moment of devotion before it was replaced with self-preservation. Every person close to him had their own agenda, their own interests, their own ambitions. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that the circle had to be destroyed, and the only way to do that was to neutralize their leadership. Viktor paced the floor of his office, his eyes occasionally flicking to the map of Eastern Europe pinned to the wall. He traced the lines of smuggling routes, the paths of communication, the key strongholds. His fingers brushed against the photo of the operation's target, the compound deep in the mountains where the circle's core leadership met in secrecy. It was supposed to be a clean strike, one that would leave the circle's leadership disoriented and vulnerable. But now, with the looming threat of betrayal hanging over him, Viktor couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping out of his control. The circle, after all, was not some small-time operation. It had been around for decades, weaving its influence across borders, its network spanning continents. It had its fingers in everything: drugs, arms, and human trafficking, money laundering, and corrupt governments. The circle wasn't just a gang, it was a state within a state, an empire built on secrecy and manipulation. And Viktor had dared to challenge it. He had built his empire, bit by bit, but the circle's reach was vast, its power unrivaled. For the first time in years, Viktor felt vulnerable. He had been too consumed with his own rise, his own ambition, to truly understand the depths of the enemy he was facing. It wasn't just the circle's power he had underestimated, it was their ability to adapt, to weave through any obstacle, to remain hidden even when all signs pointed to their downfall. They had outlasted so many before him. What made Viktor think he was any different? The sound of his phone ringing interrupted his thoughts. Viktor grabbed the receiver, his heart skipping a beat as he answered. It was Arkady. "I've been looking into it," Arkady's voice crackled through the line. "There's no easy way to say this, Viktor. The mole's real. We've got someone on the inside, and they're feeding information to the circle." Viktor's stomach turned. The very words he had feared had now been confirmed. His empire, his carefully crafted network of loyalty and power, was compromised. The sense of betrayal cut deeper than any wound, and for a brief moment, Viktor felt the crushing weight of it. The moment he had feared for so long had arrived. But Viktor wasn't a man to crumble under pressure. He had always thrived in the face of adversity, and this would be no different. The question now was not how this had happened, but what he would do next. "Who is it?" Viktor asked, his voice calm, though inside, the storm was raging. "I'm still working on it," Arkady replied. "But I've narrowed it down. I'll have a name for you soon." Viktor exhaled slowly. He could feel the cold steel of resolve settling in his chest. This was not the time for weakness. His men had failed him, yes, but the circle was not going to get away with this. His empire was built on power, on the iron grip of control. If someone inside was working against him, they would be dealt with swiftly, without mercy. There was no room for traitors in Viktor's world. Find out who it is. And when you do, make sure they're dealt with cleanly, Viktor ordered. No loose ends. Arkady hesitated for a moment. Understood. But, Viktor, there's more. The circle knows we're coming. They've set a trap. The operation you planned, it's been compromised. Viktor's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. How? We don't know all the details yet, but it's clear that they've anticipated our moves. We're being watched. The compound, the communications, everything is under surveillance. They've made adjustments, and we're walking into a storm. Viktor closed his eyes for a moment, his mind racing. He had always known that a direct assault would be dangerous, but this was something else entirely. The circle had always been a few steps ahead of him, but this was something different. They had been waiting for him, just as he had been waiting for them. Change of plans, Viktor said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We move faster, harder, and we adapt on the fly. We hit them before they hit us. I'll make the arrangements, Arkady said, and the line went silent. Viktor stood in his office, staring at the map once more. The pieces of his empire, the ones he had carefully placed, seemed to be crumbling before him. Every calculation, every moment of strategic genius, felt insignificant now in the face of this betrayal. The weight of it was suffocating. Yet Viktor could not afford to show weakness. Not now. Not ever. He had made his decision. The circle would fall, and he would be the one to bring it down. The mole would be dealt with, the operation would continue, and no matter what it took, Viktor would finish what he had started. His ambition, his thirst for power, had always been his driving force. And now, with his back against the wall, Viktor would prove that even in the face of betrayal, nothing could stop him. He had come too far to let it slip through his fingers. The night was quiet, but for Viktor Petrov, it was anything but peaceful. His thoughts were a chaotic storm, each gust of wind pushing him further into uncertainty. The plan to infiltrate the circle's leadership was in motion, but the sense of betrayal weighed heavily on him. The mole within his ranks had shattered the sense of trust that had once been the backbone of his empire. How had it all come to this? How had his careful calculations led him into a trap that the circle had set with such precision? Arkady had already begun tracking down the mole. Viktor knew that every second mattered now. His operation had already been compromised, and there was no time to waste. The men who had sworn loyalty to him, the men who had been by his side through countless battles, were now suspect. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Viktor knew that this was the harsh reality of the underworld. There was no room for weakness, no room for doubt. One moment of hesitation, one lapse in judgment, and it could all come crashing down. Viktor's fingers drummed against the wooden desk, the rhythmic sound echoing in the silence of his office. He stood, pacing the room, trying to piece together the fragments of the situation. The circle had always been a step ahead, their vast network of spies and informants ensuring that they were always prepared for any threat. Viktor had always respected their power, their ability to outmaneuver anyone who dared challenge them. But now, for the first time, he was facing a challenge that even he might not be able to overcome. He had underestimated them. Viktor had built his empire with cunning, strength, and ambition, but he had not accounted for the depth of the circle's reach. They had been watching him long before he had even considered striking at their heart. And now, as the mole's betrayal loomed over him, Viktor realized just how small his world had become. Every decision, every move he made, was being scrutinized by an unseen enemy. The silence in the room felt suffocating, and Viktor struggled to push away the nagging thoughts that clouded his mind. The plan was simple: strike hard, strike fast. But how could he proceed when he wasn't sure who he could trust? He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to gauge their loyalty and ambition. But now, with everything on the line, his judgment felt clouded. Was Arkady really the man he thought he was? Was anyone truly loyal? Viktor turned away from the window, his gaze landing on the maps that lined the wall. The Circle's operations were vast, spanning continents, and Viktor's mind raced as he considered their next move. They were operating under the assumption that the leadership compound deep in the mountains would be a safe haven, an impenetrable fortress where they could regroup and strategize. But Viktor knew better than to rely on the idea of invincibility. The Circle had made a critical mistake: they had underestimated him. The sting of betrayal still cut deep, but Viktor was a man of action. He would not let this setback define him. He had made it this far by embracing risk, by turning the tables on his enemies when they thought they had the upper hand. This was no different. But to succeed, he would have to adapt, to think quickly, and most importantly, to find a way to outsmart the people he had once considered allies. His mind turned back to the plan. The first phase had been simple enough: get in, neutralize the leadership, and dismantle the core of the Circle. But now, with the mole's existence revealed, the risk had multiplied exponentially. Viktor's operatives had been working undercover, their identities buried deep within the Circle's network. Their positions were compromised, and they would have to move quickly before the Circle could respond. Viktor's eyes narrowed as he considered the details. He needed to move fast, but he also needed to be precise. Arkady had promised to uncover the mole's identity within the hour, but Viktor knew that time was slipping away. The Circle was not the kind of organization to take a threat lightly. If they had figured out Viktor's plan, then they were already preparing for a counterattack. There would be no time for second chances. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything Viktor had worked for would collapse in an instant. He felt the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like an iron cage. He had always been the master of his fate, the one pulling the strings, the one who dictated the terms of every negotiation. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was the one being hunted. The Circle was closing in, and Viktor had to move faster than ever before. His thoughts turned back to Arkady. The man had always been loyal, at least, Viktor had believed so. But in this world, loyalty was a fleeting thing. It was a currency that could be spent and discarded with ease. Viktor had learned that lesson the hard way. There were no guarantees, no assurances. Even the closest ally could turn against you when the price was right. The idea of betrayal from Arkady was a bitter one, but Viktor knew that he could not afford to let sentiment cloud his judgment. He had to focus on the task at hand. The Circle needed to be destroyed, and he needed to move quickly. His reputation, his empire, and his very life were on the line. He reached for the phone, his fingers hovering over the numbers. He needed to contact his trusted lieutenants, the ones who had always stood by him. He needed to make sure they were ready, that they understood the stakes. But before he could dial, the phone rang. Viktor picked it up, his heart racing. "Viktor, it's done," Arkady's voice came through, cold and sharp. "The mole is dealt with." Viktor exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the danger was far from over. The Circle was still out there, and they would come for him with everything they had. But Viktor was ready. The mole had been removed, the plan had been adjusted, and the operation was still in play. "We move," Viktor said, his voice steady. "No more hesitation. We strike fast, we strike hard." The time for second-guessing had passed. Viktor knew that in this world, there was only one rule: survive, no matter the cost. And if that meant burning bridges, betraying the very men who had once been his allies, then so be it. His empire would not fall, not today. The sound of boots on the ground echoed through the narrow corridors of Viktor Petrov's compound. His men moved with purpose, every footfall measured and deliberate, as if the weight of their mission hung like a fog in the air. Tonight, the stakes had never been higher. The circle had made its move, its operatives fanning out across Europe, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Viktor had always known that this day would come, but even he hadn't anticipated how quickly things would escalate. The game of cat and mouse was over, the chase was on. Viktor stood at the center of his operations room, watching as his lieutenants prepared for the next phase of their plan. The betrayal of the mole had shaken him, but it had also galvanized him. He had no choice but to press forward. The circle was out there, and Viktor knew that they would stop at nothing to crush his empire. He had made a powerful enemy, but Viktor Petrov was no stranger to power. He had built his kingdom from the ground up, and he wasn't about to lose it without a fight. "We move tonight," Viktor's voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it. His men didn't need to hear fear in his tone. They needed to see strength. "Everything we've planned, every move we've made, it's all been leading to this moment. No more hesitation. We hit them before they hit us." His words hung in the air like a promise. The circle was well known for its ability to predict and counter moves. Their network was vast, their intelligence unmatched. But Viktor had something they didn't: desperation. He was backed into a corner now, and that gave him the one advantage he needed, the element of surprise. For all the ruthlessness Viktor had displayed in his rise to power, he had always been a student of human nature. He understood fear, ambition, and the way men thought when their backs were against the wall. And right now, the circle was underestimating him. They had written him off as just another player, another gangster vying for power. But Viktor was no mere gangster. He was a strategist, a chess player, and tonight, he would show the circle just how wrong they were. His mind returned to the map of Europe pinned on the wall, a tapestry of smuggling routes, criminal connections, and safe houses. He could feel the weight of his empire in every line, every connection, every risk they had taken. Each one had brought him closer to this point, closer to dismantling the circle once and for all. The target compound, the heart of their operations, was located deep in the Carpathian Mountains, isolated and protected by layers of security. The circle had always prided itself on its impenetrability. But Viktor knew that their hubris would be their downfall. The trap had been set, but the question remained: who would fall into it first? Viktor could feel the tension building inside him, a tightness in his chest that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The mole had been dealt with, but there were still so many unknowns. Who among his men could he trust? Who among them might have already bent the knee to the circle? The thought gnawed at him, but Viktor pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt now. If he let the paranoia take root, he would lose his edge, and losing his edge meant losing everything. His lieutenants, Arkady, Mikhail, and Boris, stood at attention, awaiting his next orders. Viktor looked at each of them carefully. They had been with him for years, had helped him carve out his place in the criminal underworld. They were loyal, weren't they? Of course, they were. Loyalty in this world was a currency, one that Viktor had spent wisely. But even loyalty had a price. He had learned that the hard way over the years, as many of his so-called allies had turned against him when the tide shifted. "We're moving in," Viktor repeated, his tone colder this time. "Get the men into position. And make sure every route is covered. I don't care if they're hiding behind every tree in the mountains, we find them, and we destroy them." The room was silent as his men scattered to execute the plan. Viktor watched them go, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between the immediacy of the mission and the distant echo of what had been lost. He had started this journey with a sense of purpose, a clear vision of what he wanted: power, control, respect. And now, after years of blood and sacrifice, he was about to face the ultimate test. He had spent his life outmaneuvering rivals, eliminating threats, and consolidating power, but the circle wasn't just another rival. They were a beast that would stop at nothing to ensure their survival. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The criminal world was built on a foundation of betrayal and blood, and Viktor had lived by that code. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about power. It was about something deeper, something that he had come to realize only in the last few days. The circle had taken something from him. They had shown him how fragile even the most powerful empires could be. And now, Viktor wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting for vengeance. The convoy moved out of the compound, sleek black vehicles slipping into the night like ghosts. Viktor sat in the back of the lead car, his thoughts consumed by the path ahead. The men around him spoke in low voices, checking weapons and preparing for what lay ahead. But Viktor's mind was elsewhere. Every move, every decision, every life that would be lost tonight had been weighed carefully. The circle had made their mistake, and Viktor was determined to make them pay for it. He knew that this would be a long, brutal night. There would be no room for mercy, no second chances. The circle had taken everything from him, his trust, his loyalty, his sense of control. And Viktor would make sure they paid the price for it. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, as if nature itself was warning them away. But Viktor welcomed the challenge. He wasn't afraid of the darkness. It was in the darkness that he had built his empire, and it was in the darkness that he would bring the circle to its knees. The car sped through the winding roads, each turn bringing them closer to their goal. Viktor's grip on the armrest tightened, his knuckles white with tension. The moment of truth was almost upon them. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, each pulse a reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just a mission anymore. This was the final act in a long, bloody war, a war that Viktor was determined to win. As the convoy neared the compound, Viktor gave a single nod to Arkady. The signal was clear. It was time to strike. The night air in the Carpathians was cold enough to bite at the skin, but Viktor Petrov barely felt it. His focus was unbroken, razor-sharp, his eyes locked on the distant compound that loomed like a fortress of shadows beneath the moonlight. The circle's headquarters stood on a plateau above the tree line, an abandoned Soviet communications base, now repurposed into a nest for one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in Eastern Europe. Layers of security, motion sensors, armed guards, fortified gates, protected what lay within. To most, it would have been an impossible target. But Viktor wasn't most men. He crouched behind a cluster of pine trees, binoculars pressed to his face. The glow of floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the compound's perimeter. His men were spread out across the valley, silent and waiting for the signal. Every movement had been rehearsed, every escape route mapped. Yet even the best-laid plans carried risk, and tonight, risk was their only companion. Arkady crouched beside him, scanning the compound through night vision goggles. "They've doubled patrols," he muttered, his breath visible in the cold. "They know something's coming." Viktor didn't answer immediately. He could feel it too, the energy of men who knew they were being hunted. The circle wasn't blind, they had eyes everywhere. But this wasn't about surprise anymore. This was about dominance. "Good," Viktor finally said, his tone steady. "Let them prepare. It won't save them." He lowered the binoculars and took a slow breath, the kind one takes before stepping into something irreversible. The plan was simple in design but lethal in execution. Two flanking teams would breach from the north and east, drawing enemy fire while Viktor and Arkady led the central strike through the main gate. Once inside, they would head straight for the command hub. The goal wasn't to destroy the circle's operation entirely, it was to decapitate it. Remove the head, and the body would collapse. But as Viktor checked his watch and prepared to give the signal, a whisper of doubt brushed through his mind. Not fear, never fear, but awareness. Something about this felt too smooth. Too easy. The circle prided itself on its intelligence network. Would they really let him get this close without resistance? He pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford hesitation. The radio in his ear crackled softly. "Team Alpha in position," a voice whispered. "Team Bravo ready." Viktor nodded once to Arkady. It's time. The first explosion shattered the silence. A fireball lit up the night sky as one of the outer gates erupted in flame. Gunfire followed immediately, short, controlled bursts echoing across the valley. The tranquility of the mountains was broken, replaced by chaos. Viktor and his team sprinted forward, weapons drawn, their movements coordinated and silent despite the violence erupting around them. The front gate was heavily reinforced, but Arkady's team had already set charges. The blast tore through the steel like paper, sending debris raining down. Viktor moved first, stepping through the smoke and into the compound with the confidence of a man who belonged there. His men fanned out, clearing corners, neutralizing guards before they could even raise alarms. Inside the compound, the corridors were narrow and dimly lit. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and old concrete. Viktor's boots echoed softly as he led his squad deeper into the heart of the circle's stronghold. He had expected resistance, but the silence was eerie. Too few guards. Too little defense. Something's wrong, Arkady hissed behind him. Viktor didn't respond. He knew it too. Every instinct screamed that they were walking into a trap, but it was too late to turn back. They reached a fork in the corridor. Ahead, faint light spilled from a half-opened steel door. Voices murmured inside. Viktor raised his hand, signaling his men to halt. He crept forward and peered through the opening. Inside, several men sat around a long metal table. Their faces were hard, expressionless. At the head sat a figure Viktor recognized instantly, Konstantin Varenko, one of the circle's senior lieutenants. The man who had ordered the hit on Viktor's informants in Odessa. Viktor stepped through the door, weapon raised. "Konstantin," he said softly. "We meet at last." The men inside turned slowly, their movements unhurried. Varenko's lips curved into a faint smile. "Petrov," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "We were expecting you." Before Viktor could react, a metallic click echoed behind him. The sound of safeties being switched off. He turned slightly, just enough to see that the hallway behind them was now filled with armed men, the circle's enforcers, emerging from hidden passages like phantoms. "Ambush!" Arkady shouted, diving for cover. Gunfire erupted in a deafening roar, the confined space amplifying every shot. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls, sparks dancing like fireflies. Viktor dropped to one knee, returning fire with brutal precision. Two of the circle's guards went down instantly. Chaos consumed the room. Varenko had already moved behind cover, barking orders in Russian. Viktor and his men were outnumbered, but retreat wasn't an option. The only way out was forward. "Push through!" Viktor shouted, signaling Arkady to flank left. His men responded with ruthless efficiency, advancing inch by inch under heavy fire. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder. Screams mixed with the sharp staccato of automatic fire. Viktor moved like a shadow, focused, relentless. He took down one guard after another, but for every one that fell, another seemed to appear. A grenade clattered across the floor. Viktor reacted instantly, grabbing Arkady and pulling him behind a pillar just as the explosion tore through the room. The shockwave hit them like a wall, throwing dust and shrapnel into the air. Viktor's ears rang, his vision blurred, but he forced himself up. He couldn't stop now. Through the haze, he saw Varenko trying to escape through a side door. Rage surged through Viktor like a current. He sprinted after him, dodging debris and bullets alike. He caught up just as Varenko reached the exit. Viktor tackled him to the ground, their weapons clattering away. The two men struggled, fists landing with bone-cracking force. "You think you can destroy the circle?" Varenko hissed, his voice trembling with both fury and disbelief. Viktor pinned him down, his expression unreadable. "No," he said quietly. "I think I can end you." The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the corridor. Varenko went still. Viktor stood slowly, breathing hard. His men were regrouping, pulling bodies aside, reloading weapons. The compound was still burning, and alarms wailed in the distance. They had taken heavy losses, but the Circle's leadership had been dealt a devastating blow. Arkady limped toward him, blood on his sleeve. "We did it," he said, voice strained. Viktor looked back at the smoldering ruins, his expression unreadable. "No," he replied. "Not yet." He knew that Varenko was only one piece of a much larger machine. The Circle would not die tonight, but it had been wounded. And Viktor Petrov, the man they once dismissed as a shadow, had just declared war. The night wind howled through the broken walls as Viktor turned away, his silhouette framed against the burning compound. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. There was no triumph here, only the quiet, burning promise of what would come next. The aftermath of the raid left Viktor Petrov with a sense of cold accomplishment. The smoke from the burning compound still hung thick in the air, swirling like the remnants of a battle that had been fought, but not yet won. His men moved through the wreckage, checking for survivors, securing what was left of the Circle's operations. Yet, as the adrenaline began to fade, a quiet unease settled over Viktor. He had struck hard, but in this world, no victory came without consequences. The Circle was wounded, but it was far from finished. Viktor stood alone on the edge of the compound, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The mountains around them were shrouded in mist, as if even nature itself wanted to forget the violence that had just unfolded. There was no time to savor the victory. There never was. In his world, there was always another battle, always another fight for power. And tonight, the cost of that fight had been high. Arkady approached cautiously, his face grim, a bloodied cloth pressed to the wound on his side. "We've taken the compound," he said, his voice hoarse, the weight of the night's events hanging heavily in his tone. "But the Circle's leadership is still out there. We know they're planning something bigger." Viktor nodded without speaking. He had felt the presence of something larger looming behind the immediate chaos. A few key figures of the Circle were dead, but the network remained intact. The empire they had built was vast, too vast to be shattered in one night. Viktor's attack had sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, but it had also ignited a firestorm. The Circle would retaliate. They always did. And now, Viktor had to prepare for the next phase of the war. In the distance, he saw a few of his men loading up the remaining supplies, documents, files, and weapons they had managed to secure from the compound. Arkady was right, there was no time to rest. The intelligence they had seized from the Circle's operation was a goldmine, but it was also a roadmap for the next move. Viktor knew that whoever controlled the flow of information in this world controlled the future. And right now, that future was uncertain. "We need to regroup," Viktor said finally, his voice low but resolute. "We've made our move, but we have to stay ahead. The Circle won't wait long to hit back." Arkady looked at him with a mix of respect and wariness. He had been with Viktor for years, and in that time, he had learned to read the signs. Viktor wasn't just a man of action, he was a man of strategy. And right now, there was a cold calculation in Viktor's eyes, the kind that told Arkady their war was far from over. "Where do we go from here?" Arkady asked, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and urgency. Viktor glanced back at the burning compound, then turned away, his thoughts racing. "We've gathered enough intel to know that they're vulnerable. We'll use this to our advantage, but we need to hit them hard, before they have time to regroup." They had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead. The Circle had enemies on every corner of the globe. It was a hydra, and Viktor knew that cutting off one head only meant another would grow in its place. The struggle for control over the underworld was more than just a war for money or power, it was a war for survival. And as much as Viktor had built his empire on the backs of his enemies' failures, he also understood the price of ambition. One wrong move, and he could lose everything. The night was quiet now, the sounds of gunfire and explosions a distant memory. But Viktor couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He turned to Arkady, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Have you checked the men? Everyone accounted for?" Arkady nodded, though his expression betrayed his unease. "Most are accounted for, but there are a few missing. It's strange. We'd already cleared the compound, but some of the men vanished after the initial sweep." Viktor's heart skipped a beat. The idea of a traitor in his midst was always a possibility, but after tonight, it felt more like a certainty. The circle had spies everywhere. Viktor had never trusted anyone completely, and now, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his empire felt like they were closing in. "Find them," Viktor said firmly. "No one leaves until we're sure we haven't been compromised." Arkady turned to follow the order, but Viktor's thoughts were already racing ahead. The circle had known they were coming, had been prepared. That wasn't coincidence. The missing men weren't just deserters, they were likely the ones feeding information to the enemy. Viktor's jaw clenched. The betrayal could have come from anyone, an old ally, a trusted confidant, or worse, someone close to him. As the night wore on, Viktor's men continued to search the compound for the missing operatives. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath. Every creak of the building, every distant sound, seemed to set Viktor's nerves on edge. But it wasn't just the traitors he was worried about. It was the bigger picture, the looming threat of retaliation from the circle. Arkady returned after what seemed like hours, his face grim. "We found them," he said quietly, almost apologetically. 3 of them. They were hiding in a supply room, armed and ready to make a run for it. They were the ones feeding information to Varenko. Viktor didn't need to ask how they had dealt with the traitors. He could already guess. There was no place for weakness in his operation, no room for loyalty to be bought or sold. In the world they inhabited, betrayal was the deadliest sin. The consequences were always swift and irreversible. "Make sure it doesn't happen again," Viktor said coldly. "And keep an eye on everyone. We can't afford any more surprises." Arkady nodded, his face hardening. "Understood." With the immediate threat of the traitors dealt with, Viktor turned his attention back to the task at hand. The circle might have lost a few key figures, but the organization was too vast, too interconnected to be taken down in a single stroke. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Viktor's mind raced as he thought about the next steps. The information they had gathered was crucial, but it wasn't enough. They needed to strike before the circle could rally their forces. But the question remained, where would the next battle take place? Where would the circle make its move? It was time to regroup. Time to plan the next strike. And this time, Viktor would make sure that no one, not even the circle, would see it coming. The following morning brought with it a chilling silence that felt heavier than the gunfire of the night before. The smoke from the burned compound still drifted across the valley, curling lazily into the pale dawn sky. Viktor Petrov stood apart from his men, staring down at the charred ruins. The battle had been won, but the victory felt hollow. His instincts, the ones that had carried him through decades of survival in the criminal underworld, were whispering the same warning again and again: this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far worse. He had dealt a brutal blow to the circle, one that would ripple through every corner of the European underworld. But such strikes never went unanswered. The circle was not a gang or a cartel, it was a network, a shadow government of criminals that reached into politics, finance, and intelligence. They didn't just retaliate, they reconstructed, re-emerged, and eradicated those who dared challenge them. Viktor had thrown the first stone, and now the avalanche would come. As he watched the first rays of sunlight spill over the ridges, Arkady approached from behind. His movements were slower today, the exhaustion visible in every step. "The men are ready to move," he said quietly. "We've gathered everything from the wreckage. The intel, the documents, it's all being transported back to Kiev." Viktor nodded, his mind already turning over the possibilities of what that information might hold. The files they had seized from the compound were a treasure trove of secrets, financial accounts, encrypted communications, and, most importantly, a partial list of names. Some belonged to politicians and businessmen he recognized, men who wore suits by day and dealt death by night. Others were unknown, ghosts hidden within the circle's machinery. But Viktor knew that among those names lay the key to dismantling their power. Still, the unease in his gut wouldn't fade. He turned to Arkady. "How many casualties?" Arkady hesitated before answering. 23 confirmed dead. 8 wounded. 2 missing. Viktor's expression hardened. "Missing? Could be deserters," Arkady said carefully. Or they were taken," Viktor finished for him. His tone was flat, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his anger. "Find out which." He turned away, the conversation ending there. His mind was already moving to the next step. He had men in Kiev loyal to him, financiers in Odessa, and informants scattered through Warsaw and Prague. He needed to tighten his network, to prepare for the inevitable counterattack. The circle's reach extended beyond guns and money, they controlled information, influence, and fear. Viktor couldn't outgun them forever. He needed to outthink them. Later that day, the convoy began the slow journey back toward Kiev. The roads through the Carpathians were narrow and winding, lined with dense forests that seemed to hold their breath as the black SUVs passed. Inside the lead vehicle, Viktor sat in silence, staring out the window at the passing landscape. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the crunch of tires over gravel became the backdrop to his thoughts. He replayed the events of the night before, each detail burned into his memory. The ambush, the betrayal, the explosion, everything had unfolded too perfectly. The circle's response had been quick, too quick. It was as if they had known exactly when and where he would strike. The mole had been found, but the leak hadn't been sealed. There was someone else, someone higher up, someone still feeding them information. Arkady sat beside him, studying a tablet that displayed the decrypted fragments of the circle's files. "Look at this," he said after a long pause. "One of the accounts traces back to Zurich. Offshore banking, but the routing number connects to an intermediary in Kiev. Whoever's running this is moving money through our own city." Viktor's brow furrowed. "Through Kiev?" "Yes," Arkady continued. "Which means either we've been blind to it, or someone's been letting it happen." Viktor leaned back, the realization settling in like ice. The circle's power wasn't just external, it had already infected the city he ruled. That explained their precision, their insight into his movements. They weren't just watching him from afar, they were inside his walls. The convoy stopped at a checkpoint near the border. As Viktor stepped out, the cold wind stung his face. He looked up at the sky, gray, muted, and heavy with the promise of snow. There was something poetic about it, he thought. The calm before another storm. "Once we reach Kiev," Viktor said to Arkady, "I want every contact reevaluated. Every partner, every informant. If anyone so much as breathes wrong, I want to know about it. No one is above suspicion." Arkady nodded. "And the files?" "Send copies to our people in Zurich and Vienna," Viktor said. "See who reacts. The circle will have to move to cover their tracks. When they do, we'll follow the trail." It was the kind of plan Viktor excelled at, pressure from the shadows, subtle moves that forced the enemy to reveal themselves. But even as he gave the orders, he could feel a weight pressing on his chest. This war was changing him. Once, his battles had been for money, territory, and reputation. Now, it was personal. The circle had made it personal. As night fell over the road, the convoy neared the outskirts of Kiev. The city lights shimmered faintly in the distance, a reminder of the empire Viktor had built, a web of influence that stretched from the slums to the parliament buildings. But beneath that glow lay darkness. He could feel it, the slow, deliberate movement of unseen forces working against him. When they arrived at his mansion on the Dnipro River, Viktor dismissed the guards and went straight to his private study. The room was dim, lit only by the warm flicker of a single lamp. Maps, files, and photos covered the large oak desk. He poured himself a glass of vodka and stood silently for a moment, staring at the reflection of the city lights on the river outside. There was a time when this view had given him peace, a sense of control, of purpose. Now it only reminded him how fragile that control truly was. The circle was like a shadow stretching over everything he'd built. No matter how bright the lights burned, the darkness always lingered. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was Arkady again. "There's something you should see," he said, holding a phone in his hand. Viktor took it, glancing at the screen. A video message played, grainy, dark, but unmistakable. A man sat bound to a chair, his face bruised and bloodied. One of the missing operatives from the compound. A distorted voice spoke in Russian, "You think you've won, Petrov. But you've only opened the door. We're coming for everything you love." The message ended. Viktor stared at the screen for a long time, his jaw tightening. Then, slowly, he handed the phone back to Arkady. His voice was low, almost calm. "Prepare the safe house. Double our security. And find out who sent that message." Arkady nodded and left the room. Viktor remained by the window, the lights of Kiev flickering in the distance. The game had shifted. The circle had made its next move. And Viktor Petrov, the man they once called the Shadow Ledger, knew that from this point on, there would be no turning back. The war was no longer about survival, it was about domination. And Viktor was ready to burn the world if that's what it took to win. Viktor paced the length of his private study, his mind racing with the implications of the video. The voice had been chillingly calm, the threat unmistakable. His pulse quickened for a moment, but he quickly suppressed it. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, a grim determination settled over him. The circle's message was clear, they were no longer playing by the same rules. They weren't just trying to eliminate him, they were trying to break him. And Viktor wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not now, not ever. He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on the maps and documents spread out on the table before him. The game had changed. The stakes were higher, and the enemy was now too close for comfort. Viktor knew one thing for certain, he would not be outmaneuvered. He had come too far, endured too much. The circle thought they had him cornered, but Viktor was a master of survival. And he would do whatever it took to protect his empire, even if it meant bringing the full force of the underworld to bear against them. The weeks that followed the fall of Levon were marked by an eerie calm, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Viktor's men tightened their grip on the remaining territories, and whispers of his ruthless retribution spread like wildfire. Yet, the shadows lingered, darker than before, as the circle began to regroup. Viktor had won a significant victory, but the price was evident. The circle was not finished, it was evolving, adapting. And now, Viktor had become its primary target. As the pressure mounted, Viktor found himself more isolated, both in mind and in action. His every move was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed. Paranoia, the very force that had once driven his rise to power, now wrapped its cold fingers around him, tightening with each passing day. He could no longer trust even his closest allies. There was always the lingering question, who else had been compromised? The walls of his empire were cracking, and Viktor knew that if he didn't act decisively soon, everything he had fought for would crumble. His next move had to be precise, surgical, or he risked losing everything. The war was no longer just about power, it was about survival. And Viktor would do whatever it took to ensure that he was the last man standing. As the dust settled and Viktor's empire stood unchallenged, a strange emptiness filled the void left by the conflict. The circle had been obliterated, their influence dismantled piece by piece, until they were nothing more than a distant memory, like the fading echoes of a storm long past. But for Viktor, the victory was hollow. The city of Kiev, once a bustling nexus of his power, now seemed quieter, as if the streets themselves had exhaled a collective sigh of relief. He had won the war, but in doing so, he had lost something that could never be reclaimed, his humanity. Sitting alone in his office, Viktor looked out over the skyline, the lights twinkling in the distance like stars. His empire was secure, but at what cost? Those who had stood by him, those who had fought beside him, were scattered or gone. He had become the very thing he had once despised, the unyielding, unfeeling king of an empire built on fear and blood. He had no friends, no allies, just a kingdom of shadows. And yet, despite it all, he couldn't bring himself to regret the path he had chosen. Because in this world, survival was the only truth, and Viktor Petrov had mastered the art of survival.